Hey Rebels, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I hope to answer the question that's on everyone's mind. Is the bull market over? Has Bitcoin peaked? Will there even be an altcoin season this cycle? With peak fear and uncertainty in the markets, as well as some conflicting data, this is kind of a loaded question. But what if I told you that there's data out there that suggests that this time actually isn't different and history is just repeating itself? If that sounds good, like and subscribe, and let's dive into the analysis. What I have in front of me here is a chart of Bitcoin as well as the liquidations this bull market. And I want to just kind of go through and see what typically happens when we have major liquidations in the market. So obviously a couple weeks ago, we had the most major liquidation event in crypto history. If we go back to the February lows of 25 this year, you can see that the liquidations didn't necessarily mark the exact low, but price didn't fall much further than that after that before we basically based out and punched higher. We go back to the most significant before that, August of 23, pretty much marked the local low before we kicked off the next leg of the bull market. Going back in time again, November of 22, pretty much marked the low of the entire bear market, and the bull market's been going for 3 years after that. This one back here in June of 22, I believe that was the FTX low. Again, didn't mark the exact low of the cycle, but you can see that prices barely drifted any lower than that before price went higher. And interestingly enough, we didn't really see a huge amount of liquidations during the bear market, which kind of makes sense because volumes are often low during those times. So if this is just another major liquidation event in a bull market, it stands to reason that we could potentially base out from here. Doesn't mean prices can't go any lower, but it's quite possible that we don't go much lower before we base out and basically punch on higher. So that's one data point that I think is very useful for me. The other one that I've looked at several times is the funding rate. And I'll just go through this one very, very briefly. And I just want to see what happens when we have very low funding rates or even negative. So the last time we had negative funding rates here or low levels of funding rates pretty much marked the lows here around here. And if we go back here again, very, very low funding rates, kind of low interest in the market. That basically kicked off that leg. Going back again, negative funding rates, kicking off a next leg. Majorly negative funding rates basically marked the end of the bear market. So really what the reason I'm pointing this out is because we've had, it's only one data point and it's pretty granular, but we had very, very low levels of funding coming in during these times right here, kind of around those liquidations. So that's another positive sign. The other thing I want to get into in this video are certain things that must happen if we are to see an altcoin season. Okay, so history seems to be repeating itself. We're seeing similar patterns in the market. I talked about this one in a previous video. But there are a few things that need to happen in order for us to kind of confirm that as a move. So here we have 2017 in October. We had this corrective period before we aggressively pushed higher in the altcoins. This is basically the total three versus Bitcoin. And in October of 2020, same thing, corrective period in October, aggressive push to the upside. We had a false start. We did have kind of an aggressive push there for about a quarter. But this, I think, is what threw everybody off. So basically, for an entire year, we haven't gone anywhere in Bitcoin or in the altcoins, really leaving a lot of uncertainty in the market. But we're basically right where we were a year ago. We haven't really, the USD charts on a lot of the altcoins maybe tell a different story, but the strong ones pretty much right where we left off a year ago. So not much has changed, but there's a lot more fear in the market now than there was, even though prices are relatively the same. So we could also be basing out here to see a push higher. I also have had that demonstrated in the others versus Bitcoin, where I had this buy zone marked up on the channel months and months ago, where it's just an area where typically altcoins seem to bottom against Bitcoin before they make their run. And we've had that. Does not mean that we can't come bleed down here a little bit more before we actually push higher. A break of this trend is going to confirm that for us and make us feel a lot more confident that that analysis is going to play out. Okay. So that is one thing that I think must happen is we must break this trend. We haven't done that yet this cycle, but that's what happens in the previous cycles where we break that downtrend after bottoming out and a push higher. So that's something that we need to see. The other thing that I've noticed is a lot of people this cycle I noticed were really waiting for the Bitcoin dominance to fall a lot sooner. That just hasn't happened. We've just had the sustained grind of Bitcoin dominance, just grinding up and just not giving anything up to the altcoins. So what I've really marked out here is just a weekly chart of Bitcoin measuring from the lows to the highs, about 154 weeks. That's about what that cycle was. And if we just project that off of the low, we can see that that got us pretty darn close. Everybody was basically convinced, again, same thing, Q4 of last year, that this was the end of Bitcoin dominance. We talked on the channel that that might not be the case because we know, as far as the cycle analysis goes, that we could have a little bit longer before Bitcoin dominance breaks down in a larger way. So I think really what got people all hiccuped was this move last cycle, and again, this move last cycle in the altcoin space, where we just had that fake out last year. And so everybody's basically unconvinced that it's even possible at this point. And it does make sense too, because Bitcoin has typically peaked out in Q4, and we're on that time frame for that to happen again if you subscribe to the 4-year cycle, which I wouldn't fade that, but it's also likely that 4-year cycle is not just going to repeat infinitely and forever. It follows the debt refinance cycle, which that cycle seems to be lengthening. And so it stands to reason that if it's followed that cycle consistently, that it's probably still following the global liquidity. So I have a couple charts that represent that. A couple of them, this one's Bitcoin versus the liquidity index. And, you can see that 90%, I think it is, 90% of Bitcoin's movements are correlated with global liquidity. Same with the NASDAQ. I think it's even closer. It's high 90s correlated to global liquidity, right? And so basically, if we have global liquidity on the rise, we can expect that Bitcoin is going to perform strongly. I have that in the charts here. We've talked about this many times on the channel. This one is, I believe, a 12-week lead. And you can see that the peaks and the troughs of this chart just line up very nicely with the price within a few weeks, typically, okay? And so that was another lead that we had on the channel for a long time, as we knew that basically this September, October area was going to be a little bit tricky because we had some kind of correction, but we can see that we're still just trending higher. We're trending higher. We haven't seen a major rollover in the liquidity with lower lows and lower highs. So we're basically just still trending up. And so I think, if history is to repeat itself and Bitcoin is still tracking global liquidity up to 90%, well, yes, we have a little bit of divergence here. It's not going to mark every move to the tick, but we can see that we're basically just still on track with that. The other thing that I think we need to see is an increase in the ISM, which is basically the business cycle. And every cycle, if we go back, we can see this is the ISM. It's basically representing the business cycle, and we have expansions and contractions. Anything below 50 is considered in contraction. Anything above 50 is considered expansion. And we can see here, I've just kind of marked the tops of the ISM, but we can see that when the ISM is going up, that's when we see the aggressive pushes in the altcoin space, right? We have this massive expansion here that basically correlates very nicely with the rapid expansion of the altcoins. So even though we've been in contraction for the ISM, we've still just kind of been grinding higher. So we've still had increases in global liquidity. We found liquidity elsewhere, and we've just kind of been grinding higher, but we just haven't seen that push in the ISM, and therefore we haven't seen that in our altcoins. So because the ISM usually oscillates and does not bottom for very long, this, I think, is another thing that's throwing people off. So I think the other thing we need to see in order for us to have that kind of euphoric expansion and end of the cycle phase, I think we need to see an expansion in the ISM. The one good news I can see here is that we are getting higher lows and higher highs. So we are grinding higher. And the other thing that I have here is Jillian Biddle. He's one of the guys over at the head of research at Global Macro. And they have had this chart up for a very long time. This is global financial conditions, which leads the ISM by 9 months. And you can see that we've basically bottomed in financial conditions, and we've had this rapid expansion to the upside, and the ISM is soon to follow. So although the business cycle has been lagging this cycle and kind of throwing things off, I don't think that things are actually different, right? History rhymes, it doesn't repeat necessarily, but there are a few factors at play. And luckily for us, there's very few factors that really matter in these markets, and they're still seeming to play out as they normally have. So we have kind of had like this year gap that is throwing people off, and everybody's trying to call the top at the top. I think it's typically dangerous. That usually doesn't happen, right? That you're not able to actually call the top. The other thing that needs to happen, in my opinion, for this altcoin season or to get another expansion in the bull market is for the volume to start basing out above these levels or at these levels. Obviously, we had this huge uptick in the volume, which was a positive sign, and we're snapping back down pretty rapidly. That also makes sense because we basically just had this big panic event and there was a huge influx of volume in the market. What we want to see is volume stick around. It's okay that we come back down to these levels. Hopefully, what we'd like to see is forming higher lows still. Even with this outlier move, we'd like to see higher lows. We don't want to see ourselves starting to base down in these levels that we saw last year, and in 2004. We don't want to see ourselves coming back down and basing in those levels. We're not there yet, but it's just something to keep an eye on. Another thing that is positive here that has worked time and time again over the cycles is this cycle composite. And this one in particular is the 5-year and the 10-year cycle for Bitcoin. We have the actual price in blue and then the composite in red. And you can see that just directionally, this thing has been playing out to a T very well with some minor divergences. We've seen one recently, right? But we can tell that basically this September, October area was a little bit less easy. We were basically chopping and not trending. And you can see that the later half of October, we start to trend a little bit clearer. So are we starting that now? That is definitely a possibility. So with all these things combined, I just wanted to make this video to say that this time might not be any different. It's always good to be cautious. We can't ignore that some of the time frames for Bitcoin and the Bitcoin cycle have ended, but we also can't ignore the things that have been pushing Bitcoin this entire time, which is global liquidity, up to 90% correlated to global liquidity. Global liquidity is still on the rise and projected to continue, even though we are nearing the end of that liquidity cycle. So how do you play that? Analysis and trading are different things. If you've been holding out on altcoins this entire time, you need to have your invalidations to the downside for sure. But I'm just wanted to come on here to basically show that I don't think that this time is any different. I don't think that this market is going to end in peak fear. I think that all the comments on Twitter and in the comments down below are basically saying you're an idiot if you didn't sell, or I sold, you're an idiot, it can't possibly go any higher. That's what everybody said every time. Every time we had one of these events, everyone was saying it was all over here. Everybody said it was all over here. Everybody said it was all over here, here, and here. Basically, every single time you have these, emotional events in the market, everybody is calling for the end and that this was the top and this is the end and it's all down from here. And it just hasn't happened. That's what happens in a bull market. Eventually, they'll be right. But you kind of want to side with the data and not with your emotions on this. Okay. So the data is showing that it's quite possible that this is just another liquidation event in an ongoing bull market, in a bull market that has not yet peaked. So anyway, hopefully that was hopeful. Hopefully that was helpful. Like and subscribe. Please leave some comments down below if you made it this far. I really appreciate it. Comments definitely help me out and definitely help the channel out. And yeah, I'll be getting into some more videos on different analysis, but so far we're still in strong territory on this particular move. Something I didn't get into in the weekly analysis is that Bitcoin held up relatively strong, but we're kind of on a teeter's edge. I think that's part of the reason why we're so uncertain right now. We do have higher highs and lower lows, so the market is technically uncertain. It is literally uncertain. There's no trend right now on the weekly time frame, and we're just kind of basically teetering on the edge. We closed just right here at these tops. We didn't, but we also closed above these lows just barely. So we're just kind of teetering on that uncertainty, which just makes sense. We've talked about that a lot on the channel as well with this 3-week down signal. And basically, I've been calling, once this signal printed where we had these 3 red weeks, for an entire month, I've been calling for lower prices below this signal. We just got that. Okay, so we were prepared for that on the channel. We weren't afraid. We also knew about the Bitcoin weakness because we've talked about it many times on the channel about our speed line and how this move was technically weaker than this move. So since basically August, we've been talking on the channel how the Bitcoin is showing the signs that it's starting to slow down. So to me, that is promising as far as the capital rotation into the riskier assets. This may be the time that Bitcoin dominance falls down even more aggressively and gives its way to the altcoins, which we saw in the beginning of the video here, if I can find it. And yeah, basically that's just, oh, excuse me. This is basically what we've been bracing for. Everybody's been waiting for this altcoin season, and now everybody thinks it's over, and everybody's basically ran for the hills. It's probably the time where that's usually how things go. Basically, once everybody capitulates, now there's room for the upside because there's no more sellers. So all the people that are basically weak hands have already sold, and the only people who are still in the market are the diamond hands, and they're not willing to sell because they want to bid up the price. So I think that those are all promising signs that this time actually isn't different, and I think it's dangerous to call a top. We have to just basically keep coming back to the markets and keep coming back to the charts and have the charts give us the data and follow as much data as we can and not get too blindsided to one side or the other. I don't want to come on here and be a perma bull. There's a lot of content out there where people are really hyped up and like have been calling for an altcoin season for the last several years, and we just haven't had it, and they rely on your attention to get views, and that's how they make their business, and I understand that. I don't want to come on YouTube and tell you that it's all gravy and it's all over, but I do want to tell you that, like, hey, the risk reward right here is a lot better than it has been for a long time. And you might want to be paying attention when everybody's leaving and everybody's exiting, the train leaves empty. Okay. So hopefully that was helpful. Like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, guys.